had no choice but to call the police on you. You left me no option. But the body cam tells a different story. It shows you started it all.
The fluorescent hum of room 304 was the only sound for 3 seconds after Mr. Garland made the statement. It was supposed to be an advanced placement history discussion on the post-war era, specifically the turbulent summer of 1968, but Garland had veered off course. He stood there, chalk dust settling on the shoulders of his tweed jacket, and said it with the confidence of a man who had never been pulled over for a broken taillight or watched his father tense up at the sight of a cruiser in the rearview mirror. He said that looking at the raw data, police actually treated young black men with excessive restraint compared to the statistical likelihood of criminality in their neighborhoods. He said the media had manufactured a crisis of victimhood. The silence that followed was not the silence of agreement. It was the silence of a vacuum, the air sucked out of the room by the sheer density of the falsehood. I sat in the third row, my hand hovering over my notebook, the ink from my pen bleeding into the paper because I had stopped writing mid-word. I looked around the room. There were 24 students. 2 of us were black. The other, a quiet girl named Sarah, was staring strictly at her desk, shrinking into herself as if hoping the floor tiles would open up and swallow her whole. She was practicing the art of invisibility, a survival mechanism passed down through generations. I, however, felt the heat rising up the back of my neck, a physical manifestation of the history Garland was so casually rewriting. This was the black tax in real time. The moment where you have to decide between your dignity and your grade, between speaking the truth and being labeled disruptive. I cleared my throat. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Mr. Garland turned, his eyebrows raised in a performance of innocent curiosity. I asked him, keeping my voice level and devoid of the aggression he was likely scanning for, if he had included the statistics on stops without probable cause, or the disparity in sentencing for the same crimes. I asked him if his data accounted for the lived experience of the people in this very room. Before Garland could answer, Kyle, the captain of the debate team sitting 2 rows over, let out a scoff that was designed to be heard. Kyle leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips, and said that I was proving Mr. Garland's point. He said that people like me always looked for racism to excuse a lack of compliance. He used the word compliance like it was a holy sacrament. The class giggled. It was a nervous, shifting sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. Garland did not correct him. Garland smiled. That smile was the catalyst. It was a permission structure for every microaggression I had endured in that building for 3 years. I stood up. I did not shout. I did not throw a chair. I simply began to pack my books. The physics of the situation changed instantly. A sitting black student is a pupil. A standing black student, in the eyes of Mr. Garland, is a threat. Sit down, Marcus, Garland commanded, his voice dropping an octave, trying to summon the authority of a warden. I continued to pack. I told him that I was removing myself from a hostile learning environment and would be reporting to the guidance office. I zipped my bag. That was the moment the narrative split. In reality, a student was walking out of a class to avoid an argument. In Mr. Garland's mind, a mutiny was in progress. He reached for the phone on the wall. He didn't call guidance. He dialed the code for the main office administrator. He said, loud enough for me to hear as I reached the door, that he had an aggressive student refusing to stand down and that he felt unsafe. Unsafe. The word hung in the air, heavy and ridiculous. I was wearing a cardigan and reading glasses. I had a GPA of 3.8. But the architecture of his fear did not require facts. It only required my presence and my refusal to submit to his worldview. I walked into the hallway, the heavy metal door clicking shut behind me, muffling the murmurs of the class. The hallway was empty, a long stretch of polished linoleum reflecting the overhead lights. I walked toward the office, intent on filing a complaint, intent on being the rational actor. I made it 20 feet before the double doors at the end of the corridor burst open. It wasn't the guidance counselor. It was Vice Principal Miller, and she wasn't alone. She was flanked by the school resource officer, a man whose hand was already resting on his belt, near the taser. Miller shouted for me to stop. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask why I was out of class. She saw a black boy in a hallway after a distress call from a white teacher, and the script wrote itself in her mind. I stopped. I raised my hands slightly, palms open, the universal sign of unarmed surrender. I told her I was coming to her office to report an incident. She told me to get against the wall. The resource officer moved in, his steps heavy, his eyes scanning me for weapons that didn't exist. He told me to drop the bag. I lowered it slowly. I asked, calmly, why I was being treated like a criminal for walking to the principal's office. Miller told me to stop resisting. Resisting. First compliance, now resisting. The vocabulary of control was being weaponized against a teenager who just wanted to learn history without being insulted. Then, the escalation went terminal. Miller pulled out her radio and called for local PD. She said she had an erratic subject who had barricaded himself in the hallway. Barricaded. I was standing in the middle of an empty corridor. The disconnect between reality and the report was so vast it was almost dizzying. I realized then that nothing I said mattered. My words were being filtered through a lens of bias so thick it distorted the light. I stopped speaking. I leaned back against the lockers, the cold metal seeping through my shirt, and I waited. I waited for the sirens that I knew were coming. I waited for the inevitable spectacle. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, a technique my father had taught me for moments exactly like this. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Do not make sudden movements. Do not give them a reason. But they don't need a reason, I thought. They only need an excuse. The sirens cut through the air minutes later, wailing as they approached the front entrance. I heard the squawk of radios, the heavy boots on the stairs. The doors flew open again. 2 city police officers entered, guns not drawn but hands ready. They saw the VP pointing, the resource officer hovering, and me, standing still against the lockers. And then, the saving grace, the silent observer that would eventually tear their narrative to shreds. The faint beep of the body camera on the chest of the lead officer. It blinked red. Recording. The officer approached. He looked at me, then at the VP. He asked what the problem was. Miller started to spill her story, a frantic tale of aggression, threats, and fear. She painted a picture of a monster. The officer looked back at me. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. The officer frowned. The bodycam was capturing it all. The calm stance. The open hands. The terror in my eyes that I tried to mask with stoicism. The contrast between the hysterical administrator and the silent student was the first crack in the dam. This footage, this digital witness, would eventually be played in a quiet room, exposing the lies one by one. But in that moment, as the officer reached for my wrist to cuff me, I didn't know I would be vindicated. The back seat of a patrol vehicle possesses a specific, sterile geography that feels designed to strip away human dignity. The hard plastic seat is molded not for comfort but for containment, forcing the body into a rigid, unnatural posture that mirrors the psychological constraint I had been living under for 3 years at St. Jude's Preparatory Academy. Through the wire mesh separating me from the officers in the front, the world outside became a fragmented mosaic of passing streetlights and confused pedestrians. We passed the manicured lawns of the campus, the iron gates that were supposed to symbolize opportunity, and the coffee shop where the seniors gathered after hours. From this vantage point, with my hands bound behind me, the promise of the institution dissolved into the reality of my position within it. This was the physical manifestation of the black tax. It is a term often used to describe financial burdens, the money successful professionals send home to support extended families, but there is a more insidious currency at play in environments like St. Jude's. It is the emotional and psychological overhead charged for mere existence in a space that was not built for you. It is the tax of constant vigilance, the requirement to be infinitely patient while others are allowed to be reckless, and the necessity of remaining silent while others are allowed to scream. Everything you just witnessed in that hallway, the shouting administrator and the smirking student, was not an isolated explosion but the inevitable result of a debt I refused to pay any longer. The black tax demands that when we are insulted, we must find a way to make the insulter feel comfortable. It dictates that when we are threatened, we must de-escalate the person threatening us. It requires us to absorb the anxieties of the white people around us, to metabolize their fear of our black bodies, and to present ourselves as harmless, smiling, and docile. If you fail to pay this tax, if you dare to stand tall and speak with a level voice, you are technically in arrears. You become a problem. You become aggressive. You become a target for the state. Mrs. Higgins called the police not because I was violent, but because I had stopped subsidizing her comfort with my silence. She panicked because the script she knew had been flipped. I was the one using logic, and she was the one using volume. In her world, a calm black boy is more terrifying than a furious one because his calmness implies a power she cannot control. To understand the magnitude of this tax, we have to rewind the clock 3 hours, back to the classroom where the ledger was first opened. It was a Tuesday, typically a day for advanced placement history, a subject I usually enjoyed because facts, unlike feelings, are supposed to be immutable. We were discussing the civil rights movement, specifically the late 1960s. The teacher, Mr. Henderson, a man who prided himself on being a provocative intellectual, had opened the floor to a debate about the effectiveness of nonviolent protest versus more direct action. It was a trap, of course. These debates always were. They were arenas designed to let students play devil's advocate with human rights while I was expected to sit there and represent the entire diaspora. That was when Kyle spoke up. Kyle was the son of a prominent donor, a boy who wore his entitlement like a varsity jacket. He leaned back in his chair, chewed on the end of his pen, and said loud enough for the back row to hear that police brutality was a myth constructed by the media. He said that if people just complied, if they just followed orders, nobody would get hurt. He looked directly at me when he said it. Then he went further. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the quiet tension of the room. He said that black men were actually treated with kid gloves by the police, that society was so afraid of being called racist that we got away with everything. He mocked the idea of fear. He mimicked a trembling voice, pretending to be a victim, turning the generational trauma of millions into a punchline for a Tuesday morning history class. The room went silent. The air left the space. Every eye shifted to me, waiting for the reaction. This is the moment the tax collector arrives. The expectation was that I would either explode in anger, proving Kyle's point about aggression, or I would laugh along, paying the price of my dignity to keep the peace. I did neither. I looked at Mr. Henderson, waiting for the adult in the room to intervene, to correct the blatant falsehood, to manage his classroom. Mr. Henderson did nothing. He shuffled his papers, looking down at his desk, terrified of offending the donor's son. His silence was an endorsement. By saying nothing, he agreed that my history was up for debate and my reality was a joke. So I spoke. I did not shout. I did not curse. I stood up, adjusted my tie, and asked Kyle a simple question. I asked him to cite his sources. I asked him to explain the statistical disparities in sentencing. I asked him if he had ever had to have a conversation with his parents about how to keep his hands visible when walking into a store. I dismantled his argument with the precision of a surgeon, using the very facts Mr. Henderson was supposed to be teaching. I used the tools of the academy against the prejudice of the privileged. Kyle didn't have facts. He only had feelings and the inherited confidence of someone who has never been told no. His face turned red. He began to stutter. He couldn't handle the intellectual pushback because he wasn't used to a world where he wasn't automatically right. That was when he slammed his desk and called me a slur. It wasn't the worst one, but it was enough. It was a word meant to put me back in my place. And still, Mr. Henderson did nothing to him. Instead, he looked at me and told me to calm down. He told me I was being confrontational. He told me I was making the other students uncomfortable. That is the essence of the black tax. I was the one being slurred, I was the one being mocked, yet I was the one responsible for the emotional equilibrium of the room. When I refused to sit down, when I refused to accept that Kyle's comfort was more important than my dignity, the system began to grind its gears. Mr. Henderson sent me to the office, not Kyle. He sent the victim to be punished because the victim refused to be victimized quietly. In the hallway, on the way to the office, the narrative was already being rewritten. I wasn't the honor student defending his heritage, I was the angry black male disrupting the learning environment. By the time I reached Mrs. Higgins' office, the story had mutated. I wasn't there for a debate, I was there for insubordination. And when Mrs. Higgins saw me standing there, refusing to hunch my shoulders, refusing to look at the floor, refusing to apologize for existing, she felt that same fear Mr. Henderson felt. She reached for the phone. She didn't call my parents. She called the police. Sitting in the back of that cruiser, watching the familiar world retreat into the distance, I realized that I was currently living out the very scenario Kyle had mocked. I had complied. I had followed the rules. I had remained nonviolent. And yet, I was in handcuffs. The irony was suffocating. But beneath the fear, beneath the anger, a different sensation began to take root. It was a cold, hard resolve. I remembered the camera. I remembered the small red light blinking on the officer's chest. They thought they were taking me to a holding cell, to a place of shame. They didn't realize they were creating the evidence that would destroy them. They didn't understand that the black tax works both ways. Yes, it is a burden we carry, but the pressure of that burden creates diamonds. It creates a resilience and a sharpness that they cannot comprehend. I had spent my life preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every time I had to code switch, every time I had to de-escalate a situation, every time I had to be twice as good to get half as far, I was training for this war. This isn't just a story about a bad teacher or a racist student. It is a story about the breaking point. It is about what happens when you decide to stop paying the tax. Over the next 40 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly how this played out. I am going to show you how the system is designed to protect itself, and how that protection becomes its undoing when faced with undeniable truth. To understand how I walked out of those handcuffs and into a settlement check that would change my family's life, you need to understand 3 specific pillars of survival. These are the lessons I learned in the fire, the strategies that took me from a suspect to a victor. We will explore the defense of excellence, the weaponization of your own achievements. We will dissect the art of the switch, the ability to navigate 2 worlds simultaneously. And finally, we will open the archive, the collection of receipts and records that turns their lies into dust. The police car turned a corner, and the station came into view. The officer in the front seat adjusted his mirror to look at me, expecting to see tears. He saw only stone. The ride was over. The real fight was just beginning. The heavy oak doors of the Central Library did not just open, they groaned, a warning to anyone who entered that this was a place of solemnity, a cathedral of silence where the only accepted currency was knowledge. I had spent more hours in the back corner of the reference section than I had in my own living room, carving out a sanctuary between the stacks of encyclopedias and bound periodicals. This was my domain. The air always smelled of dust and vanilla, the scent of lignin breaking down in paper, a perfume that signaled safety to me. Outside these walls, I was a demographic, a statistic, or a threat depending on who was watching. Inside, seated at the mahogany table with the brass lamp casting a golden circle over my AP Calculus textbook, I was simply a mind. This is where the defense of excellence begins. It does not start in the confrontation, it starts in the preparation. It starts with the understanding that for people like us, mediocrity is a luxury we cannot afford. To be average is to be invisible at best, and suspicious at worst. To survive, and more importantly, to win, one must construct an armor so blindingly bright that it deflects the arrows of bias before they can even pierce the skin. On that Tuesday afternoon, the library was nearly empty, save for the librarian, Mrs. Gable, who was shelving books 3 rows over, and myself. I was not merely studying, I was fortifying myself. My notes were color-coded, my textbook was open to page 142, and my calculator was positioned with military precision. I remember the specific problem I was solving, a derivative that required the chain rule, a complex puzzle that demanded total focus. This level of meticulousness was not an accident. It was the first layer of the defense. When you are impeccable, you remove the easy handles that authority figures use to grab you. If your shirt is tucked in, if your voice is modulated, if your grades are perfect, you force them to invent a reason to target you. And when they have to invent reasons, they make mistakes. They reveal their hand. I did not know it then, but I was laying a trap for the man who was about to walk through those doors. The silence was broken not by a whisper, but by the sharp, rhythmic click of hard-soled shoes on the linoleum floor of the entryway, transitioning to a muffled thud on the carpet. The cadence was fast, aggressive. It was not the walk of someone looking for a book, it was the walk of someone looking for a problem. I did not look up. That is part of the discipline. To look up is to acknowledge the intrusion, to validate the disturbance. I kept my eyes on the calculus problem, my pencil moving steadily across the graph paper. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my table. A shadow fell over my work, blotting out the light from the brass lamp. I finished writing the final integer of the solution, placed my pencil down gently, and raised my head. Standing there was Vice Principal Halloway. He was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, uncomfortable and constantly in need of adjustment. He was new to the district, brought in to restore order, which usually meant imposing his will on those he deemed disorderly. He looked at the books. He looked at the calculator. He looked at me. I could see the cognitive dissonance firing behind his eyes. The scene did not match the script in his head. He was patrolling for truants, for vandals, for noisemakers. Instead, he found a young black man in a button-down shirt, surrounded by higher-level mathematics, sitting in perfect silence. A smarter man would have nodded and walked away. But Halloway was not a smart man, he was a proud one. And the defense of excellence, while protective, has a side effect: it intimidates the insecure. My competence was an affront to his expectations. He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound that seemed profane in the quiet of the library. He asked to see my hall pass. His tone was not inquisitive, it was accusatory. He assumed I did not have one. He assumed I was hiding. This is the moment where the training kicks in. The instinct is to be defensive, to get angry, to ask why he isn't checking the white students in the courtyard. But emotion is the enemy of the defense. Emotion gives them the footage they want. If I raise my voice, I become the aggressor. If I slam my book shut, I become the threat. Instead, I moved with the slow, deliberate calm of a bomb disposal technician. I reached into my backpack, not my pocket, keeping my hands visible at all times. I withdrew my student planner, flipped to the current date, and slid it across the table. The pass was signed by my calculus teacher, Mr. Henderson, timed for exactly this period. It was ironclad. I watched Halloway pick it up, inspecting the signature as if looking for a forgery. He turned it over. He looked at the time. There was nothing there. The document was perfect. He tossed the planner back onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and hit my arm. The disrespect was calculated. He wanted a reaction. He needed me to give him cause. When the paperwork failed him, he shifted tactics. He told me that this area was reserved for research, not for socializing. I looked around the empty table. I looked at the empty chairs. I looked back at him. I stated, clearly and without inflection, that I was not socializing. I was studying for the AP exam, which was 3 weeks away. I gestured to the open textbook. I told him that I was currently maintaining a 4.2 GPA and that this library time was essential for my academic standing. I used his language. I used words like academic standing and essential. This is the weaponization of vocabulary. It reminds them that you are not beneath them. You are their intellectual equal, perhaps their superior. His face flushed a mottled red. He was losing, and he knew it. The defense of excellence was reflecting his own bias back at him like a mirror. He couldn't arrest me for studying. He couldn't suspend me for having a pass. So he escalated to the abstract. He told me I was being insubordinate. He said my tone was disrespectful. This is the final refuge of the tyrant. When they cannot attack your actions, they attack your attitude. He ordered me to pack up and leave the library. He said I was banned from the premises for the remainder of the week. This was unlawful. The student handbook, which I had memorized, stated clearly that library privileges could only be revoked for documented behavioral infractions. I did not move. I did not pack my bag. I sat still, my hands folded on the table. I asked him politely to cite the specific rule I had violated. I asked him to explain how sitting silently with a valid pass constituted a behavioral infraction. I told him that I would be happy to leave if he could provide a legitimate reason, but until then, I had an exam to prepare for. I turned my attention back to my book. I picked up my pencil. I resumed the calculation. It was the ultimate act of defiance. I ignored him not out of rudeness, but out of righteousness. I denied his reality and substituted the truth. I could feel his anger radiating off him like heat from a pavement. He stammered. He pointed a finger. And then, he played his final card. He reached for his radio. He called for the school resource officer. He reported a student refusing to leave and creating a disturbance. He lied. And he did it while I sat there, writing out a differential equation. As I waited for the police to arrive, I did not tremble. I did not cry. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. I knew that the body camera on the officer's chest would capture everything. It would capture the empty library. It would capture my open books. It would capture Holloway's flustered aggression and my seated composure. The defense of excellence ensures that when the record is played back, there is no ambiguity. I was building the evidence for my own exoneration in real time. I was not just a student anymore. I was a litigant. I was a witness. I understood that my grades, my attire, and my calm were not just for college applications. They were for survival. They were the shield that would stop this man from destroying my future. The siren wailed in the distance, getting closer, but inside the library, it was still quiet. I turned the page. I kept reading. I let him watch me learn. The air in the library shifted as the blue and red lights from the cruiser outside began to strobe against the high windows, cutting through the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. I did not look out the window. I did not stand up to check the parking lot. I kept my eyes fixed on the paragraph regarding the socio-economic impacts of post-war zoning laws, though the words were beginning to blur as my adrenaline spiked. This is the physiological betrayal of the body. The heart wants to race, the hands want to tremble, and the voice wants to crack. This is biology screaming flight or fight. But in that moment, I had to override biology with architecture. I had to build a wall between what I felt and what I showed. This is the second pillar of survival in a hostile institutional environment. I call it the internal volume knob. It is the ability to recognize that the louder the opposition becomes, the quieter you must be. Administrator Holloway was currently operating at maximum volume. He was pacing near the circulation desk, his shoes squeaking aggressively against the linoleum, a jarring sound in a sanctuary designed for whispers. He was rehearsing his opening statement to the officers, muttering about insubordination and threats, creating a narrative of danger where none existed. He needed me to be a threat. His entire justification for escalating a library dispute into a police encounter relied on me transforming into the caricature he held in his mind. He needed me to yell back. He needed me to stand up and wave my arms. He needed noise. And I determined right then that I would give him absolute silence. The heavy double doors at the front of the library swung open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a gasp. 2 officers walked in. The first was tall, holding his belt with one hand, his radio crackling with static that seemed to tear the quiet atmosphere apart. The second was younger, hand resting near his holster, eyes scanning the room for the danger they had been promised. They saw the rows of books. They saw the empty tables. And then they saw Holloway, who immediately rushed toward them, hand extended, finger pointing back at me like a loaded weapon. He began speaking before they even fully crossed the threshold. He spoke of refusal to vacate, of aggressive posture, of the safety of the students, though there were no other students present. He was breathless, his face flushed a mottled red, his tie slightly askew. He looked frantic. In contrast, I remained seated. I turned the page of my book with a deliberate slowness that felt heavy in the air. This was the calibration. I imagined a mixing board in my mind, a series of faders and dials. I located the fader labeled fear and slid it down to 0. I located the fader labeled diction and slid it to maximum. I located the fader labeled volume and turned it down until it was just above a whisper. This is the counterintuitive physics of power. When you shout, people hear your anger. When you whisper, people are forced to listen to your words. They have to lean in. They have to quiet themselves to hear you. By lowering my volume, I forced the entire room to recalibrate to my frequency. The officers approached the table. The older one looked at Holloway, then at me, then back at Holloway. The cognitive dissonance was already visible on his face. The dispatch call had likely described a disturbance, a volatile subject, perhaps a trespasser refusing to leave. What he found was a young man in a button-down shirt, surrounded by textbooks, looking for all the world like he was preparing for the bar exam. Holloway stopped talking for a moment, waiting for the officers to seize me, to validate his panic. The silence stretched. The older officer stepped closer to my table. He did not draw his weapon. He did not shout. He simply asked what was going on. This was the moment. The trap was set. If I spoke with attitude, if I spoke with the slang of my neighborhood, if I spoke with the indignation I righteously felt, I would validate Holloway's prejudice. I would become the problem. Instead, I engaged the code switch. Code switching is often described as a burden, a masking of one's true self to appease the dominant culture. And it is that. But in this moment, it was not a mask. It was a shield. It was a weapon. I closed the book gently, keeping my finger inside to mark my place, signaling that I intended to return to it. I looked up at the officer, making direct eye contact, but with a softness that signaled cooperation, not challenge. I spoke clearly, enunciating every consonant. I told him that I was studying for my AP history exam. I explained that I had a pass to be in the library during this period. I gestured to the open notebook where my notes were neatly transcribed. I did not mention Holloway's aggression. I did not accuse him of racism. I did not complain about unfair treatment. I stuck strictly to the logistical facts of my presence. By stripping the emotion from my voice, I made Holloway's emotional state look hysterical by comparison. The body camera on the officer's chest was a blinking red eye, recording this contrast. It was recording the signal-to-noise ratio. I was the signal. Clear, coherent, logical. Holloway was the noise. Erratic, loud, emotional. In the court of public opinion, and in the review of police conduct, the calmest person in the room is usually presumed to be the most rational. I was weaponizing rationality. Holloway realized he was losing the room. He stepped forward again, interrupting me, his voice rising an octave. He told the officer that I had refused a direct order to leave. He claimed I had glared at him in a threatening manner. He used the word threatening 3 times in 2 sentences. The younger officer looked at me. I was still seated, hands visible on the table, posture relaxed. The accusation of being threatening collided with the visual reality of my stillness. The absurdity of the claim hung in the air. The internal volume knob requires a discipline that burns. It requires you to swallow the bile of injustice and digest it into fuel for performance. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask why my existence in a library was a threat. I wanted to ask why his inability to control his temper became a law enforcement issue. But I knew that the moment I asked those questions with heat, I would lose. So I asked a different question. I asked the officer if he would like to see my student ID and my hall pass. I offered documentation. I offered bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is the language of the state. By speaking it fluently, I identified myself not as a suspect, but as a citizen. The older officer nodded. I moved my hand slowly to my backpack, narrating my actions as I did so, ensuring there was no ambiguity about my intent. I retrieved my wallet and the laminated pass. I placed them on the table. The officer picked them up, inspected them, and handed them back. He turned to Holloway. The dynamic had shifted. The officers were no longer Holloway's enforcers, they were now neutral arbiters, and the evidence was heavily weighted against the administrator. The officer asked Holloway, with a tone of distinct weariness, why exactly the police were called for a student with a valid pass studying in the library. Holloway sputtered. He tried to backtrack, talking about school policy and tone of voice, but it was too late. The contrast had been established. The internal volume knob had done its work. I had lowered the temperature of the interaction to a point where Holloway's heat looked insane. He was a man shouting at a statue. He was a man fighting a ghost. I had removed myself as an opponent and replaced myself with a mirror. When he looked at me, he didn't see a defiant student anymore. He saw his own lack of control reflected back at him, recorded in high definition. This technique is not fair. It is not just. It places an agonizing burden on the marginalized to be perfect, to be stoic, to be superhuman in the face of degradation. It demands that we suppress our humanity to survive those who have lost theirs. But fairness is a concept for the history books I was reading. Survival is the imperative of the room I was sitting in. The internal volume knob is a mechanism of survival. It buys time. It buys safety. And most importantly, it buys credibility. As the officers began to question Holloway, asking him for his identification, asking him for a statement, I saw the realization dawn on him. He had called the police to remove a problem, but he had inadvertently documented his own incompetence. He had invited the state to witness his bias. I opened my book again. I found the paragraph I had been reading. I did not smile. Smiling would be an aggression. Smiling would be gloating. I simply returned to my work. The most powerful message I could send was that this interruption, this man, this police presence, was trivial compared to my education. I tuned them out. I turned their volume down to 0. The library settled back into a tense quiet, broken only by the low murmur of the officer taking Holloway's statement in the corner. Holloway was deflated, his gestures smaller, his voice hushed. He was mimicking me now, trying to regain the composure he had surrendered. But the timestamp on the video would show who held the line first. I read the words on the page, but my mind was archiving the lesson. The defense of excellence provides the shield, but the internal volume knob provides the camouflage. It allows you to hide in plain sight as a rational actor in an irrational world. I had won the interaction, but the war was not over. Holloway would not forgive this humiliation. He would not forget that a student had outmaneuvered him without standing up. He would look for another angle, another weakness. I had to be ready. The police eventually left, casting one last look at me, not of suspicion, but of confusion, perhaps even respect. Holloway retreated to his office, slamming the door. The sound echoed. I waited for the echo to fade. Then, and only then, did I allow my hand to shake, just once, beneath the table. I took a deep breath, reset the dials, and turned the volume of my ambition back up to maximum. The heavy oak doors of the university library swung shut behind me, the hydraulic hinge hissing softly as it severed the connection to the chaotic frequency of the administrative hallway. The silence here was not merely an absence of noise but a physical weight, a pressurized atmosphere of mahogany, vellum, and accumulated time that instantly lowered my heart rate. The air smelled of dust and vanilla, the scent of paper slowly decomposing into history. I walked past the circulation desk, my footsteps absorbed by the thick, threadbare carpet that had borne the weight of 10,000 scholars before me. This was the sanctuary. This was where the variables were controlled. I needed to calibrate. My hands had finally stopped shaking, but the phantom sensation of the police officer's gaze lingered on the back of my neck like a sunburn. I navigated through the stacks, moving toward the far corner where the light was always golden and heavy with dust motes. I was not alone. Sitting at his usual table, surrounded by towers of leather-bound volumes that looked like fortifications, was Mr. Davis. He did not look up as I approached. He was a man carved from the same era as the books he guarded, wearing a tweed vest that seemed to defy the changing fashions of the last 4 decades. He was the archivist, the unofficial historian, and the only person on campus who understood the architecture of the trap I had just escaped. He turned a page with deliberate slowness, the sound crisp in the quiet. I pulled out a chair and sat opposite him. I did not speak. I did not have to. The grapevine in institutions like this travels faster than fiber optics. Mr. Davis knew. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief drawn from his breast pocket. He looked at me with eyes that had seen the same play performed by different actors 100 times since 1968. "You encountered the wolf," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the table. I nodded. "It was Administrator Holloway," I replied. Mr. Davis put his glasses back on. "Holloway is not the wolf, son. Holloway is just the teeth. The wolf is the fear that lets him bite." He closed the book in front of him. It was a ledger from the university's founding. He tapped the cover with a long, calloused finger. "You survived the encounter because you did not run. You stood still. But standing still is not enough. You must understand why you are standing." He stood up and beckoned me to follow him. We walked deeper into the stacks, to a section restricted from the general student body. The air here was cooler, the lighting dimmer. He pulled a slim, gray folder from a shelf that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "This is the intergenerational link. This is what Holloway does not have. He has authority. You have ancestry." He opened the folder on a nearby reading lectern. Inside were black and white photographs, typed letters, and disciplinary reports from 50 years ago. They detailed a group of students who had integrated the university's honors program. I saw faces that looked like mine, young men and women in cardigans and horn-rimmed glasses, staring down shouting crowds with expressions of serene indifference. "Look at them," Davis commanded. "What do you see?" I looked closer. I saw tension in their jaws, but their postures were relaxed. They were holding books. They were writing. "I see focus," I said. Davis nodded. "That is the armor." In 1968, the administration tried to expel a student named Marcus Thorne for disruption. They claimed his presence in the library was inciting violence. They called the police. Just like today. I looked at the grainy photo of Marcus Thorne. He was sitting at a table, surrounded by officers, calmly taking notes from a physics textbook. He didn't argue. He didn't scream. He documented. Davis tapped the photo. Thorne knew the law better than the officers. He knew the university bylaws better than the dean. When they arrived, he didn't plead his case. He cited the code. He showed them the timestamp on his library entry card. He showed them the syllabus requiring the text he was holding. He made it impossible for them to arrest him without breaking their own rules. That is the lesson. The system is designed to crush resistance, but it is often paralyzed by compliance. If you are excellent, if you are undeniably correct, you become a glitch in their matrix. They don't know how to process a black man who follows the rules better than they do. It causes a short circuit. I felt a shift inside me. The isolation I had felt in Holloway's office began to dissolve. I wasn't just one student fighting one administrator. I was the latest link in a chain. The strategy one had used, the silence, the documentation, the internal volume knob, wasn't something I had invented. It was an inheritance. It was a survival technology passed down through the bloodline, refined in the fires of segregation and honed in the boardrooms of corporate America. Davis closed the folder. "Holloway thinks you are arrogant. He thinks you believe you are better than him. And that is why he hates you. But the truth is, you are not better than him. You are older than him. Your spirit has been fighting this battle for 400 years. He is fighting a skirmish. You are fighting a war that started before he was born. You have the advantage of experience, even if it is not your own. I ran my hand over the gray cover of the folder. The texture was rough, like sharkskin. So what do I do next? I asked. Davis smiled, a rare expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Now, you utilize the receipts. You have the bodycam footage. You have the truth. But you do not release it like a bomb. You release it like a cure. You let the truth do the work. You do not need to be angry. The facts are angry enough on their own. He walked back toward the main reading room, his gait slow but steady. I followed him, feeling the weight of the library shift. It was no longer just a room of books. It was an armory. Every volume was a weapon of mass instruction. Every citation was a shield. I realized then that my excellence was not just for a grade. It was a form of protest. My competence was a form of rebellion. By being undeniable, I was dismantling Holloway's worldview brick by brick. He needed me to be a thug. He needed me to be loud, irrational, and violent to justify his own prejudice. By denying him that image, by giving him a scholar instead of a suspect, I was starving his hatred. I was forcing him to look in the mirror, and he couldn't stand what he saw. I sat back down at the table, the silence now feeling like a fortress. I opened my laptop. The cursor blinked, waiting for my command. I wasn't writing an essay anymore. I was drafting a legal brief for my own existence. I thought of Marcus Thorne in 1968, writing physics equations while police hovered over his shoulder. I thought of the generations of men like Mr. Davis who had swallowed their pride so that I could have a voice. I felt the internal volume knob turn, not down this time, but into a different frequency entirely. It tuned into the frequency of the ancestors. A calm, cold clarity washed over me. I was ready to meticulously, quietly, and politely destroy Administrator Holloway's career. I typed the first sentence of my formal complaint. It was not emotional. It was surgical. It started with the date, the time, and the specific bylaw Holloway had violated. I was no longer the victim. I was the auditor. And the audit was just beginning. The automatic glass doors of the university library slid open with a whisper that sounded like an invitation to a sanctuary, but for weeks it had felt more like entering a gladiatorial arena where the lions wore lanyards and wielded policy manuals instead of claws. I walked through the threshold not to study this time, but to end the war that had been started against me without my consent. In my leather satchel, I carried a manila folder that weighed less than a pound but held the gravitational pull of a collapsing star. It contained the receipts. The term receipts is often thrown around colloquially to mean proof or evidence in a social spat, but what I carried was a forensic dismantling of a lie. The administrative hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning in the Dean of Student Affairs office, a room designed to intimidate with its mahogany paneling and portraits of dead men who would have likely agreed with Administrator Holloway. I arrived 15 minutes early. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings, my father used to say, but in this context, it was a tactical maneuver. I wanted to be part of the furniture before Holloway arrived. I wanted to be the stillness in the room. When I sat at the long conference table, I placed my hands flat on the surface and focused on the grain of the wood. I did not check my phone. I did not fidget. I breathed in the sterile air of bureaucracy and exhaled the anxiety of the victim. I was the auditor now. The door opened, and Holloway entered with the breezy confidence of a man who believes the system is his personal bodyguard. He was chatting with the dean, a pleasant, tired-looking woman named Dr. Eris, making a joke about the parking situation on campus. He stopped when he saw me. He didn't expect me to be so composed. He expected the angry young man he had reported, the caricature he had painted in his incident report. I saw his eyes flicker to my hands, looking for a clenched fist, but all he found were manicured fingernails resting gently on the table. He took his seat opposite me. The dynamic was set. He was the accuser, comfortable in his authority. I was the accused, expected to beg for leniency. But the folder in front of me remained closed. Dr. Eris cleared her throat and began the proceedings with the standard preamble about community standards and mutual respect. She read Holloway's statement aloud. It was a masterpiece of creative writing. It described a student who was belligerent, loud, refusing to identify himself, and causing a disturbance that threatened the safety of the library environment. As she read, Holloway nodded solemnity, wearing a mask of regret, as if it pained him to discipline a student but duty compelled him. I listened to the fiction of my own life being narrated. It was a strange sensation, hearing a story about yourself that you didn't recognize. When she finished, she looked at me over her spectacles. She asked if I had anything to say in my defense. This was the moment the script usually called for an emotional outburst. This was where I was supposed to raise my voice, to call him a liar, to fall into the trap of appearing unhinged. Instead, I slowly opened the manila folder. I did not speak immediately. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Then, I spoke in a voice that was lower than usual, forcing them to lean in. I thanked Dr. Eris for her time. I acknowledged the seriousness of the accusations. I said that if the events described in that report had actually happened, the student in question should indeed be expelled. Holloway looked smug. He thought I was capitulating. Then I said, however, we are fortunate that we do not have to rely on memory or interpretation. We have the objective reality of the Bodycam footage from the responding officer, which I requested under the Freedom of Information Act 3 days ago, and the library's own security feed, which preserves the 30 minutes prior to the incident. I pulled out a USB drive and placed it on the mahogany table. The sound of the plastic clicking against the wood was like a gavel strike. Holloway's smile didn't disappear instantly. It froze. It became a vestigial feature of a face that was rapidly realizing the terrain had shifted. Dr. Eris looked at the drive, then at me, then at Holloway. She plugged it into her laptop and turned the screen so we could all see. The video began. It showed the library corner. It showed me. I was not being loud. I was not causing a disturbance. I was wearing noise-canceling headphones, motionless, reading a textbook. The timestamp ticked away. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Absolute stillness. Then, Holloway entered the frame. The video had no audio from the security camera, but the body language was screaming. He approached me aggressively. He tapped my shoulder hard. I jumped. I removed my headphones. We watched the interaction unfold. Then, the perspective switched to the officer's bodycam footage, which included high-definition audio. The room filled with the sound of the officer asking Holloway what the problem was. We heard Holloway stammering about a threat. We heard the officer, a man who deals with actual threats, sound confused. We heard me, in the background, calmly offering my ID to the officer. We heard the officer say to his partner, "This is a waste of time, the kid is just studying." The silence that followed the end of the video was heavy. It was the heavy silence of a paradigm collapsing. The receipts were not just about proving I was innocent, they were about proving Holloway was incompetent at best, and malicious at worst. I did not gloat. I did not point a finger and say I told you so. I simply directed Dr. Eris's attention to page 4 of the university's Code of Conduct, which I had printed out and highlighted. I read the section on harassment and the misuse of administrative resources. I cross-referenced the timestamps on the video with the time Holloway claimed I was screaming. There was a discrepancy of 0 decibels. I laid out the timeline of his previous interruptions, which I had logged in a notebook he didn't know I kept. I presented the pattern. I stripped away the vague language of safety and revealed the naked structure of bias. I watched Holloway shrink. He wasn't a powerful administrator anymore. He was just a man who had lied and been caught in 4K resolution. He tried to interject, to explain that he felt threatened, but his words sounded hollow against the empirical evidence on the screen. He was arguing with a recording. He was fighting a ghost that wouldn't die. Dr. Eris closed the laptop. She looked at Holloway with a gaze that was no longer collegial. It was the look of an administrator who realizes a subordinate has just created a massive liability for the institution. She turned to me and apologized. She didn't use the conditional passive voice of mistakes were made. She said, "I am sorry this happened to you." She told me the complaint was dismissed with prejudice. She told Holloway to stay behind. I stood up. I gathered my papers. I placed the USB drive back in my pocket. I moved with the same deliberate slowness I had used when the police arrived. I buttoned my jacket. I nodded to Dr. Eris. I did not look at Holloway. To look at him would be to acknowledge him as a peer or a threat, and he was neither anymore. He was a cautionary tale. He was a footnote in the story of my education. I turned and walked out of the office, the sound of my footsteps steady on the plush carpet. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, ensuring the latch clicked into place. The sound was final. Walking back out into the main library atrium, the air felt different. It was the same recycled air, smelling of old paper and carpet cleaner, but it filled my lungs differently. The weight on my chest, the invisible hand that had been pressing down on my throat since the incident, was gone. I looked at the students studying at the tables, heads bowed over laptops and books. They were unaware of the battle that had just been fought and won in the room adjacent to them. They were safe, partially because I had refused to be a victim. I realized then that the moral victory wasn't just about clearing my record. It was about asserting that my presence here was not negotiable. It was about demonstrating that excellence is the best form of rebellion. I walked past the desk where Holloway usually sat. It was empty. It would likely remain empty, or be occupied by someone else soon. The system had tried to eject me, but like a complex equation that balances out when the correct variables are applied, the system had corrected itself, forced by the undeniable logic of the truth. I didn't go home to celebrate. I went back to my usual table. I sat down. I took out my textbook. I put on my headphones. I continued my work. That was the ultimate victory. Not the hearing, not the apology, but the return to the work. The work was the point. The work was the shield. And as I turned the page, I felt the ghostly hand of Mr. Davis on my shoulder, not holding me back this time, but giving me a firm, approving pat. The audit was complete. The account was balanced. The silence of the university library had changed its texture in the week following the hearing, shifting from a heavy blanket of surveillance to a calm, spacious quiet that felt like the air after a thunderstorm. I sat at a different table this time, near the massive arched window that overlooked the quadrangle, watching the autumn leaves drift from the oak trees like slow confetti celebrating a parade that no one else could see. The victory was real, the vindication was absolute, but the feeling inside my chest was not the exuberant joy of a sports win, but rather the deep, weary satisfaction of a structural engineer who has successfully reinforced a crumbling bridge while standing on it. Holloway was gone, removed quietly to a role where his biases could not interact with students, a bureaucratic exile that served as the institution's way of washing its hands without admitting the dirt was there to begin with. But I remained. The books remained. The work remained. This was the final lesson, the one Mr. Davis had hinted at but never fully articulated, because some truths can only be learned in the crucible of experience. The lesson was about the aftermath of dignity. It is about what you do with the receipt once the transaction of the black tax has been paid in full. I traced the grain of the wooden table with my fingertip, feeling the grooves of history etched into the varnish. A younger student, a freshman I recognized from the Black Student Union meetings but had never spoken to, walked by my table. He slowed down, his eyes darting to the stack of books in front of me, then to my face. He didn't say anything at first, just gave a subtle, singular nod. It was the universal signal, the unspoken code of acknowledgement that transcends language. It meant he knew. It meant he had heard the whispers, seen the footage, and understood the weight of the stone I had just rolled up the hill. I returned the nod, keeping my expression neutral, calm, and composed. This was the burden of the victory. I was no longer just a student trying to get a degree. I had become a precedent. I was now case law walking in human form. By standing my ground, by utilizing the receipts of logic and the undeniable footage of the Bodycam, I had unwittingly drafted a blueprint for those coming behind me. They saw that the system could be challenged, not with raised voices or physical force, which the system is designed to crush, but with the terrifying precision of absolute excellence and undeniable documentation. Mr. Davis often spoke of the long game. In 1968, he hadn't just been teaching us algebra. He was teaching us how to balance the equation of our lives in a world that constantly tried to subtract from our value. He knew that anger, while justified, was a volatile fuel that burned up the engine if used too long. Excellence, however, was cold fusion. It was sustainable. It was irrefutable. As I looked out the window, I realized that the true power of the counter-narrative I had constructed wasn't just that it proved me innocent. It was that it exposed the absurdity of the accusation without me having to say a word. The Bodycam footage didn't just show a student studying. It showed a man in deep communion with knowledge, interrupted by a man in deep communion with his own insecurities. The contrast was the weapon. The silence was the blade. I had won because I refused to play the role of the victim or the aggressor. I played the role of the scholar, a role that Holloway could not comprehend because his worldview did not have a category for a black man who was more interested in physics than in conflict. I closed my notebook, the sound distinct and final in the quiet room. The open loop that had begun with the arrival of the police officers was now closed. The tension that had vibrated through every scene of this ordeal had dissipated, replaced by a clarity that was almost blinding. The black tax is the cost of entry, yes. It is the extra energy required to be considered average, the flawless conduct required to be considered safe, the extraordinary achievement required to be considered competent. It is an unfair, exorbitant tax levied by history and maintained by prejudice. But today, looking at the empty chair where my accuser used to sit, I realized something profound about the receipt. When you pay a tax that high, when you pay it with the currency of your own resilience and intelligence, you own the space you occupy. You are not a guest. You are not a beneficiary of affirmative action or a token of diversity. You are the majority shareholder in the enterprise of your own life. I had paid in full. This library, this university, this degree, I wasn't asking for it. I had bought it. It was mine. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the library floor, stretching the legs of the tables until they looked like the pillars of a great temple. I packed my bag with the same methodical precision I had used to dismantle Holloway's accusations. Laptop, charger, textbook, headphones. Each item was a tool of my trade, a weapon in my arsenal. I stood up and pushed the chair in. It made a scraping sound, a friction that announced my presence rather than apologizing for it. I walked toward the exit, the same path I had taken 100 times before, but the ground felt firmer beneath my feet.